So they first appear in Genesis chapter 6. People don't know what to do with this. Most pastors don't know the commentaries, and they're all over the map about this, if they comment much at all. Who knows? I mean, it's a Hebrew, Nephilim. The I am at the end of any Hebrew noun means it's plural. So Nephilim, Elohim means it's plural. The I am means it's plural. But I don't know how ancient Hebrew people would have pronounced it, but Nephilim, we're close to it. So they first appear in Genesis chapter 6. The first 4 verses are verses that you'll never hear preached about hardly, because most people don't know what to do with this. Most pastors don't know. And you can look at commentaries, and they're all over the map about this, if they comment much at all. It says in verses 1 to 4, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Okay, then verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So that's where we first run into that term, the Nephilim. It's translated in different ways, but generally it's translated the giants. And that's why I'm interested in this, because I'm a big Giants fan. Both New York Giants and San Francisco Giants, but I don't think that's what it's referring to. So the Nephilim were the product of the relations between sons of God, Bene Elohim, and the daughters of man. So who were the Bene Elohim? That's the big question. Sometimes when they talk about names of God, they say, oh, Elohim, God means Elohim is not a name, it's a title, it's a status that refers not just to God, but also to other spiritual beings, evil ones as well as good ones. In fact, Satan is even an Elohim. So when it's talking about the sons of Elohim, we're talking about sons of the gods. So this goes into an ancient biblical worldview that most people don't know about. We here on planet Earth think that we're the center stage of all of God's interests. I don't think so. In fact, we're kind of like bit players in a bigger drama. You begin to see this actually in Job. In Job, when Satan appears before Yahweh, that is God's name. The true creator God told Moses, I have one name and only one name. My covenant name is YHVH is how it would be sort of spelled. We call Yehovah, but that's his name. And so in Job, it says, and Job probably was the first Old Testament book written, that Satan came before Yahweh, and Yahweh said, where have you been? And the sons of God, Satan and the sons of God. I've been out to and fro, walking around in the earth, and so on. And then God picks the fight. He says, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, and so on. And of course, that opens up the drama that Job, of course, loses everything he's got. He goes through terrible misery, scraping himself. He's lost his wife, his family, his property, his status. These 3 so-called friends show up, and they start, accusing him, and he holds on to his integrity. And at the very end, God speaks into the midst of it all and straightens them all out. And at the end of Job, I think 38, 39, God gives the most incredible statement about who he is. Okay, so that's Yahweh, Jehovah. But the sons of God are even evident there in Job. But they're there in Genesis, and then we find out about them later on. But Nephilim are the byproducts of the sexual union, we want to call it, between these sons of God and the daughters of men. Both. I mean, like we are. Okay? So, I think what's beyond the backstory of this is if you read in both Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, there are comments about who Satan was and then his fall. And the idea, and we pick this up also in Revelation 12, that when he was kicked out of heaven because of his pride and his trying to replace God and say, I can do this better than you, and God kicked him and a third of the other Elohim, the sons of God, out of heaven. And where does it say he sent them? To the earth. Now, we know the universe is pretty big, and God could have sent them anywhere. He sent them to this planet, was not yet inhabited by humans. That's why Genesis 1 starts out, the earth was without form and darkness was upon the face of the deep. It was void, but there were. So the question is, okay, then God creates light and separates the water and creates birds and fish and then mammals and so on. And every time, after every day, God says, it is good, it is good. And then after day 6, when he creates man, he says, very good. If it's all good, where did the snake come from? Where did the serpent come from? Where did Satan come from? He was already here. He was already here, I believe. Anyhow, that's where sin began, and Satan's whole purpose was and still is to corrupt everything good that God does. So God created Adam and Eve, they were good. Satan corrupted them. But when you get to this passage that we just read from Genesis 6, Satan's trying to create his beings in his own image. Because as we know from Genesis 1:27, God says, let us create beings, humans, in our image. Satan didn't like that. That may have been the reason he rebelled. We don't know. But he decided to create images of his being, and so he has these corrupt sons of God have spiritual or physical intercourse with the daughters of man and give birth to these Nephilim. Yes, that's the great question. So there are several names that they're used. The Nephilim is the first name. Studies have shown, and we find it even in the book of Enoch, okay? So the book of Enoch is not in our Bible, but it was in the Bible, so to speak, of the New Testament people. Before the canon was decided upon what should be in the Old Testament, what should be in the New Testament, both in the book of Jude and 2 Peter, there are references to the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch says that the Nephilim were 300 cubits high. Well, a cubit is 1.5 feet. So that means they were 450 feet tall. Okay, so that sounds preposterous, ridiculous, but hang on about it. Nobody knows how things like Stonehenge and Easter Island and even the pyramids were formed, right? I mean, how did that happen? They had no equipment as far as we know. The thought is, if you've got beings that are 450, I mean, just think of 450 feet. That means they can't even lie down in Red Bull Stadium. It's like it's 1.5 football stadiums long. And you've got beings like that. I imagine they had some muscle on them and they could do a bit more. So I don't know. I don't want to say that, was Enoch wrong? I don't know. Okay, so you got Nephilim. Then later on, they're called Rephidim. So Goliath was a Rephidim. Goliath, as we know, was about 9.5 feet tall. Before Goliath was on the scene, though, remember when Moses sent the spies up into Canaan, and they came back, 10 of them, terrified because we saw giants in the land, and we seemed like little grasshoppers in their sight. And so they were afraid to go there. For 40 years, they wandered around because they didn't want to go up to the Amorites and the Amalekites, which were kind of the tribal names for some of the Nephilim. Moses takes them around onto the east side of the Jordan and takes them up through all the way up to sort of what's Mount Bashan area, Caesarea Philippi area, the place of the dead. And there are two kings there, King Og and Sihon, who are both described as Rephidim. They're sons of Anak. And their beds are referred to as being 13 feet long, and 6 feet wide. And they were the last, according to the text there, of the Nephilim. So later on, there still seem to be giants, but they're called other names, Rephidim and so on. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every mention of the thought of his heart was continually evil. The Lord regretted that he made man on the earth, and he grieved in his heart, and he said, I will blot out them. And then he announces the flood. And so Noah is given, I don't know how long it took to build. The ark was huge. It was huge. And the whole purpose of the flood apparently is to wipe out this aberrant race created in the image of Satan, the fallen Elohim. And but you can't drown a spirit. So you asked me earlier, were they spirits or physical? They were drowned as beings, except the spirits. And it is thought generally, pretty widely, that the residue of the Nephilim are the spirits, which are today the demons that are in the world. Let me say one other thing, though, because somebody who's really up on this issue might say, wait a minute, they were angels. They were fallen angels. That happened because the translators of the Hebrew into Greek, which is called the Septuagint, didn't have a word in Greek to be able to describe what the Hebrew describes. So they just called them angels, fallen angels. Angels are not Elohim. And really, there were no fallen angels. What fell were the Elohim that went with Satan. But that's why in the New Testament, they're called angels because of, and almost every reference in the New Testament to the Old Testament is really citing from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament.